Welcome to Scigest, your fortnightly science from the Bioeconomy Science Institute.
Kia ora, ko Nicola Sullivan tēnei. Nau mai haere mai and welcome to another Scigest episode. Indigenous trees are vital for environmental health, biodiversity and cultural identity. They also support agriculture through shelter and improve, stabilise and boost biodiversity. And they look good. That's why Aotearoa New Zealand has bold ambitions to restore its landscapes with native trees. Today we are joined by Dr. Tom Carlin from the Bioeconomy Science Institute, Maiangi Taiao. Tom is an invasion ecologist and leads the Establishing Indigenous Forests portfolio. Tom is going to talk to us today about why Aotearoa New Zealand should be establishing Indigenous forests. Kia ora, Tom.
Kia ora, Nicola. Thank you for inviting me.
Nice to have you here. First of all, what do you mean when you talk about establishing native forests?
So at the Bioeconomy Science Institute, we've got some pretty bold ambitions about getting more native trees into the landscape, and that's for a variety of reasons. So the first one being we really want to restore our native ecosystems to help support our native biodiversity. But then there are also other uses, such as sequestering carbon or potentially using native trees for timber to support our primary industries. So there's a whole heap of reasons why we want to get native trees into the landscape, and our big goals are just to get as many trees into the landscape in appropriate places as possible.
And so are you doing that by establishing forests of single species or more diverse forest?
It's a little bit of a combination. So it really goes back to that adage of the right tree in the right place for the right purpose. So if we were looking to establish areas of native timber, for example, which is obviously a sustainable practice to help prevent A, more exotic forests being planted across New Zealand, but B, stop us from removing existing native trees, then that would be primarily a single species stand. But if we're talking about carbon forests, it would be looking at what trees are most suitable for the site and the actual microclimates available in the site. That would probably be a much more natural, complex stand. And then for our natural regenerating ecosystems, we're going to try and make them as diverse as naturally possible.
Can you expand a bit more on why we should be establishing native forests and the benefits that we get from there? You mentioned some in there.
Yeah, absolutely. So of course, New Zealand used to be covered in vast swaths of native forest. And then a large proportion of that was removed both when the Indigenous peoples arrived and then much more rapidly when Europeans colonized New Zealand. Both removing the trees, but then also introducing a whole suite of weeds and pests, which have damaged our native estate. To restore those ecosystems, we really need to start from the ground up. So that's ensuring, obviously, the soil is healthy, but then the plants are kind of forming that foundation for the ecosystem, which then will support our native birds, our native insects, our native lizards, the whole ecosystem. So that's really important from a biodiversity perspective, which then links back to particular cultural values, which are really important, particularly for Māori peoples, but also to the rest of Pākehā. I personally love going, hiking out and seeing a beautiful native forest and hearing native birds singing in the background. So very important for me. And then from a industry's perspective, there are some very valuable resources that we could potentially be utilizing, which we are not able to at the moment. Part of that is because we don't have a good understanding of A, the benefits, but B, how we best utilize that. And then there are also possible future endeavors as well. So at the Bioeconomy Science Institute, we're also looking at ways that we can extract bioactives from some of our indigenous species. And of course, to do so, we need to ensure that we have these healthy, thriving native communities.
What do you mean by bioactives?
So bioactives, talking about any sorts of compounds found inside a native species that could then be used for other means, whether that's in medical research or for skincare or for other uses, just generally, really. Native forests have, of course, adapted across millions of years to our ecology, our climates, our soil types, and they obviously are therefore very well adapted to the needs of the country from an ecological perspective. So we have trees that are fantastic at supporting a whole range of benefits, stabilizing the soil, and ensuring that we get healthy soil communities that can then go on to help other plants and, the ecosystem more broadly.
What research is your group doing currently on establishing native forests?
So our research is kind of down 3 different paths, and we're part of a much larger community, obviously, at the Bioeconomy Science Institute. But my portfolio in particular goes from how to improve native propagation technologies. So that's really focusing on that nursery level, going from the beginning. Then how do we improve establishment rates? So that's when we're putting things out into nature. And then our final tranche is how do we transition to ngahere? So actually, how do we get to a much more complex forest, a much more natural focused forest? And also, how do we understand how different communities, in particular Indigenous communities, interact with those forests?
Awesome. And given that you're working with native forests, ngahere, taonga species, I take it that you have engagement with Māori communities?
Yeah, so that's a core theme of our work, really. So we are engaging strongly with Ngāi Tahu and a range of other iwi, particularly around how do we source good seeds to then go through our research, as well as what we do with those seeds when we have them. How do we respect the manner of those seedlings, and then ultimately ensuring that we repatriate what we can when it's appropriate to. So we definitely engage with a range of iwi throughout the entire process, and we're really interested in expanding our level of research to include more Mātauranga Māori in the process.
How can this process of establishing native forests help us mitigate climate change?
It's a good one. So of course we've got huge goals such as the Billion Trees program. Many of these will be looking at establishing long, forever standing forests ideally. And a lot of the research that we're working on is how do we improve those survival rates, those establishment rates? Because unfortunately at the moment we don't have a lot of research into the underlying ecology of a lot of our native species. And that includes things like how do we ensure that they survive when we put them in the ground? Of course, there's a lot of time, money, and effort that goes into these plantings. So ultimately, if they then fail, it's not good down the track. So what we want to do is ensure that we understand where things should go, and then when we put them there, they not only survive, but they also thrive, which means they will sequester more carbon. If they're in cities, they can help prevent things like the urban heat island effect, reduce that, and otherwise just support our native species that are going to be struggling due to range shifts under climate change.
Lots of benefits, lots
Yes.
of improvements. Yeah, awesome. And on the sort of flip side of native forests, one thing that I imagine you work on as an invasion ecologist is wilding conifers, wilding pines. Can you define what is a wilding conifer or a wilding pine?
Absolutely. Yep, so wilding conifers has been a big area of my research. And when we talk about wilding conifers or wilding trees, what we really mean are trees that were planted originally, in many cases a long time ago, the original populations, that then have spread from their original plantings and become a nuisance in the landscape for a variety of reasons. So that might be invading natural landscapes, in particular our montane regions, but it also includes pasture, it can include our native forests. Most of New Zealand really is quite badly affected, so they're a very large problem in New Zealand, with over 1.5 million hectares currently covered and likely expanding.
Wow. And so how are wilding pines or wilding conifers dealt with at the moment? I know when I've been in native areas, you'll often see a lot of dead trees, which I believe are wilding pines that have been poisoned.
Yeah, absolutely. So New Zealand's lucky to have one of the kind of premier flagship programs in the world, actually, for any sort of invasive weed overall. And that's the National Wild and Conifer Control Program. And they do a fantastic job with controlling the issue, but that's not to say it's easy. So they employ a range of techniques, and it really depends on the scale of the invasion. So for quite dense forests, they'll be going through and they'll probably just be doing broadcast herbicide application. So trying to kill all of the trees so that we can then move forward and plant something else and restore that ecosystem. For more scattered invasions, there might be a range of helicopter or ground-based techniques where people are just going through and either poisoning or cutting down individual trees. And then there are also some more nuanced ideas that are in the mix that we're exploring now, one of which is using fire as a potential control mechanism. Another is biocontrol, which is looking potentially positive. But none of these are, of course, a silver bullet, and it's all going to be a combination of factors over time.
And why are those wilding pines such a problem? Isn't it good to have trees?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a whole suite of issues that the wilding conifers pose. The foremost being that they tend to outgrow and outcompete any of our native vegetation. So I can give you an example. We work primarily on a species called lodgepole pine or contorta pine. And when I was out measuring some field sites recently, they were growing at a rate of around 1 to 1.5 meters in just a single season, which is quite considerable. And they also then go on to produce tens of thousands of seeds. So they can quite quickly infill a landscape. Things like our native tussocks and our native scrub are often quite low-lying. So they quite quickly get overshadowed and then outcompeted, unfortunately. Wilding conifers are also quite thirsty, so they take up a lot of water, and they also are highly flammable. So they pose a increased fire risk to a landscape, particularly if there are scattered invasions potentially in a grassland. It could cause issues for farmers. So there are some famous examples recently, such as the fires around Lake Pukaki, which burned through some large stands of wilding conifers. And then more recently, also the Bridge Hill fire up in Arthur's Pass, which burned through some wilding conifer stands. But aside from the kind of the safety risks associated with that, they also fundamentally change those ecosystems. So they alter the microbiome of the soil, which makes it quite difficult for natives to re-establish, which is one of the reasons that we need to do a lot of work into understanding what microbiome is important for natives. And they can create these quite large seed banks as well and reinvade these areas. So our methods of control are not 100%. We're trying very hard. But in many cases, we do have to go in multiple times to remove these trees. And if they were left to spread, they would cover much of New Zealand and remove a lot of the cultural identity, remove a lot of the native biodiversity, and then also just remove a lot of the potential land uses that we could be or would want to be using the land for.
How many different species of wilding pines do we have in New Zealand?
So in Aotearoa, we've got 19 species of wilding conifer. 2 of those are widely planted forestry species. So we have radiata pine is obviously our most planted forestry species, but it's actually got a relatively low wilding risk. The other species being Douglas fir, which is less widely planted, but it is a much greater wilding risk, particularly down in Southland and Otago. But the good news around that is that they're phasing those forests out, and we're mostly dealing with legacy plantings. Of the other 17 species, the majority of these were introduced for provenance trials, trying to determine if they could be useful in New Zealand, and these were provenance trials established by the New Zealand government of the day, so thinking back 100, 150 years ago, and unfortunately then led to successive spread. The worst one of those being lodgepole pine or contorta pine, which is the only conifer species prevented from being planted under the Biosecurity Act. And the reason for that being is that they are much faster spreading, much faster reproducing than any other conifer species. And you'd be glad to know that conifer is not planted for timber or any other reason in New Zealand. We're just dealing with legacy spread.
Gosh, 19, that's a lot, isn't it? And is this particular to Aotearoa New Zealand? Other countries, do they have problems with wilding conifers as well?
So other countries definitely have issues with wilding conifers. It's very much a southern hemisphere problem. So we're dealing with typically northern hemisphere species from either North America or from Europe, which have then invaded countries in the southern hemisphere. Thinking areas like Argentina in South America, South Africa, parts of Australia. But then I think I feel confident saying that New Zealand has probably the worst invasions. And there's a few reasons for that. One is that Aotearoa is just in general such a great country for growing things. So when When plants come in, they just have a fantastic time with our conditions, our climate, our soil, everything. So these conifers just shoot right up and they'll quite readily establish. The other one being, and this is, I think, quite a key one, is that they've escaped a lot of their natural enemies. So some of my research has looked into trait shifts from conifers coming from North America into New Zealand. And when we talk about a trait shift, we're thinking ways they've adapted in New Zealand to become more invasive. And the key thing there is that we know they're producing 3 to 4 times as many seeds per cone and more cones on a tree than they would be in North America. So that's one of the reasons why these spread rates are getting so out of hand. And then the third reason that we think they're quite an issue in New Zealand is because of the extent of the plantings. So a lot of these original provenance trials where they were planting a whole bunch of things out in the same place to see kind of what would stick and what would grow well. For wind-pollinated species, that is just a great way of mixing them all up and then letting them crossbreed. So what we are dealing with at the moment, we highly suspect are not necessarily representative of any of those original plantings. We think they are probably mixes and hybrids that may not be exhibiting the same traits. We haven't done genetic analyses to prove that yet, but we do have some very strong data on their traits, which are linked to particular subspecies, and the populations that we've surveyed all across New Zealand do not actually link up with any one subspecies. They're kind of showing traits from a few different ones. So a few different reasons there.
So the research that you and your group are working on or have worked on, what are the goals? What are you hoping to achieve through that research?
So I've been lucky to be involved in a 5-year ME Endeavour program called Vive la Resistance, which is led by Dr. Thomas Paul at the Bioeconomy Science Institute. And the goals with that research, following on from a very successful Endeavour program actually called Winning Against Wildings. So Winning Against Wildings was trying to understand the root causes of the invasion. And then Vive la Resistance is trying to understand the root causes of re-invasion. So we understand that the invasions are happening and they're going quite quickly. But now that we have this data on the level of control, but they're coming back, how do we stop them coming back? Ultimately, how do we make the control successful? And now we're moving towards a future forward-thinking focus of then how do we restore those ecosystems? So looking through the entire invasion process. And some of the main outcomes of the program so far have been trying to quantify that reinvasion risk, which is where a lot of my work has come in. Then looking at novel tools to prevent the reinvasion, so that's including avenues of biocontrol. And then also how do we integrate Mātauranga Māori into these methods, and also what are the culturally important areas in wilding pine control that Māori communities are engaged with. For example, Mount Tarawera is quite a culturally important area on the North Island that we've been working with. It's also very important for the community from a business perspective because they get a lot of revenue from conducting tours. And unfortunately, the mountain itself does have a wilding pine problem, and it's a legacy issue. And so we're working towards how do we integrate and upskill communities to remove the conifers, and also how do we use the existing knowledge that they have around their ecosystems to better optimize either control methods or understanding of where pines invade.
You've mentioned a couple of times biocontrol of wilding pines. What do you mean by that, firstly, and what are some of those biocontrol options that you're looking into?
So when we talk about biocontrol, we're really thinking about using a targeted species that would naturally occur in the native range and has a negative impact on the conifers to then impact them in New Zealand. The key thing there being that it's highly targeted. So if we're looking at something for lodgepole pine, it wouldn't then jump onto other pines, and it definitely wouldn't jump onto native species. And there's a huge number of processes and steps involved in that to ensure all of those safeguards are adhered to. So we do our due diligence, and this work has been predominantly led by Ronnie Grunterman at the Bioeconomy Science Institute. Some of the key agents that we're looking into are tiger moths, rusts, and then probably the most promising one is dwarf mistletoe. So mistletoe is a parasitic plant, creates galls, so it infects the branches, creates galls and helps slow growth and impede growth. So it probably wouldn't be a silver bullet that would end the wilding conifer problem. But if it can help slow growth of large populations and particularly be released somewhere to naturally spread through those populations, then it would just give us a big helping hand on reining in the spread.
Awesome. Using nature to fight nature.
Exactly.
Help nature. Awesome. For those people that listening at home that are thinking, this is cool, there's a big problem, we want to help establish native trees, what can people do to help?
So aside from going out and getting involved in community initiatives, that can be both in the wilding pine removal side of things if they wanted to, or in the actual native planting side of things. It's really getting the education out there on how we protect our existing native areas, and then also trying to ensure that there is strong demand when policies are put forward that natives should be at the forefront. So, for example, in the Billion Trees program, many exotic trees were planted. There's not necessarily a problem with that, but what we could do is try and get a large proportion of native trees planted. And if we could do that, we would then learn a lot more about how our native trees establish, how we can improve that establishment, which can then be more widely applied across other programs as well.
Ngā mihi nui, Tom, for taking the time today to explain to us the importance of establishing native forest here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the trouble that we have with wilding conifers. When we look at our beautiful native forest areas, we can have a little more appreciation for how much they give to us, and hopefully we can find a way to help with some planting days and activities as well. And to our listeners, thanks for listening to another Scigest podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe and rate our podcast to let us know how we're doing. You can also send an email or any questions or suggestions to scigest@plantandfood.co.nz. Until next time, thanks for listening. Mā te wā.